This is a video about Feeding Tube Awareness Week 2024. So my name's Chloe Dowd and I work for Your Voice Count. I'm 25 years old and I've had a feeding tube for 5 years. I have a genetic condition called Ehlers-Danlos syndrome that impacts on my digestive system. And I've had a Hickman line for TPN, I've had an NG tube, and I currently have a PEG. On the next few slides, I'm going to talk to you about what these different feeding tubes are. So a Hickman line for TPN is a line that goes into a vein in the top of your heart and it feeds you via your venous system. And this is for people who can't eat orally because of a problem with their stomach or their bowel. An NJ tube is a tube that goes up your nose and down into your small intestine. And an NG tube is a tube that goes up your nose and down into your stomach. A PEG or a G tube is a tube that goes directly into your stomach through a small cut. And a PEG J or a J tube is a tube that goes directly into your small intestines, again by a small cut. Some of the myths and misconceptions around feeding tubes include that an NG or an NJ tube is the same as an oxygen cannula. So an NG tube or an NJ tube doesn't actually deliver oxygen, it delivers feed into the stomach or the small intestine. Another myth is that you can't drive if you have a feeding tube, which is not true. There's a lot of people who have feeding tubes who can drive. Another myth is that you die and are seriously unwell if you need a feeding tube, which is not the case for most people who have a feeding tube. It's often that they need a tube because they've either got a condition that means that they can't eat orally that affects their stomach or their small intestine, or they have problems with their swallow, or they have an eating disorder called AFRID, which is where people struggle to eat certain foods because of the texture and the taste. Another myth or misconception is that you only need a feeding tube if you have cancer or an eating disorder, which again, like I've just said, people have feeding tubes for a wide range of conditions. Another myth is that you're completely unable to eat if you need a feeding tube. There's a lot of people who have feeding tubes who either eat to get some of their calories and have a feeding tube for the rest, or they eat simply for pleasure, but don't actually get any nutritional value from the food that they eat. Another myth is that everyone with a feeding tube is underweight. There's a lot of people with feeding tubes who are a healthy weight, and that's because the feeding tube keeps them nutritionally well and makes sure that they're not losing weight. So the tube is what actually keeps them a healthy weight. Another myth is that if you need a feeding tube, you end up needing it forever, which is not true. A lot of people just have a feeding tube on a temporary basis. Tubes that are most likely to be temporary are an NG or an NJ tube, but all types of feeding tubes can be temporary. People sometimes just need them after surgery, sometimes they need them to get to a healthy weight and then are able to eat to maintain the weight. Another myth is that you're unable to do sports such as swimming if you have a feeding tube. I personally go swimming and I have done with all the types of feeding tubes that I've had. Some people are apprehensive about going swimming because they worry about infection. But if you're comfortable doing so, there's nothing stopping you from going swimming out and doing other sports. I also go to the gym and my feeding tube doesn't stop me from doing that. So thank you for listening. And if you have any questions, you can email me at chloe.dowds@yvc.org.uk. Thank you.